In the summer of 2019, three friends set out for a weekend camping trip in the Blue Ridge Mountains. They weren't thrill seekers, just ordinary guys looking for a break from the daily grind. But what started as a simple getaway would soon turn into a nightmare that would haunt them forever. Only two of them would make it out of those woods alive. Jason, Mark, and Daniel had been friends since college. They'd talked about this trip for months, planning every detail. The perfect spot, deep in the forest, where cell phones barely worked and the stars shone brighter than they'd ever seen. They arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the trees as they set up camp. The first night felt normal, almost idyllic. They built a roaring fire, cracked open beers, and laughed under a canopy of stars. Stories flowed as freely as the alcohol, old jokes resurfacing and new memories being made. But as midnight approached, a chill settled over the camp that had nothing to do with the temperature. Jason was the first to notice something was off. He swore he heard footsteps circling their campsite, just beyond the reach of the firelight. At first, Mark and Daniel laughed it off, blaming the buyer and Jason's overactive imagination. But when the sound came again, closer this time, they all fell silent. Grabbing their flashlights, they searched the perimeter of the camp. The beams of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and underbrush. No animals, no other campers. Nothing that could explain the sounds they'd heard. They returned to the fire, uneasy but trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. As they settled into their tents that night, Jason couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was out there in the dark. He lay awake for hours, bestraining to hear any sound beyond the normal chorus of the forest at night. Just as he was finally drifting off to sleep, he heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the camp. The second night brought a new terror. As they sat around the fire, trying to recapture the carefree mood of the previous evening, a sound cut through the night, whistling, slow and steady, like someone trying to get their attention. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, circling their camp with unnatural precision. Mark, always the bravest of the three, stood up and shouted into the darkness, "Who's there?" His voice echoed through the trees, but the whistling stopped instantly. The silence that followed was deafening. Whatever or whoever was out there didn't want to be seen or heard. It just wanted them to know it was watching. The friends huddled closer to the fire, speaking in hushed tones. They debated packing up and leaving, but the thought of navigating the dark forest trails at night was even more terrifying than staying put. They agreed to stick it out until morning, then make a decision. None of them slept that night. They took turns keeping watch, jumping at every snapping twig and rustling leaf. The whistling didn't return, but the feeling of being observed never left. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, they breathed a collective sigh of relief. They had made it through the night, but their relief was short-lived. As Jason crawled out of his tent, he noticed something wrong. Daniel's sleeping bag was empty. His boots were still inside the tent, along with his phone and wallet. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. Panic set in as they searched the campsite, calling Daniel's name until their voices were hoarse. They combed the surrounding forest, looking for any sign of their friend. No tracks, no torn clothing, nothing to indicate where he might have gone or what might have happened to him. As the day wore on, Jason and Mark's fear turned to desperation. They knew they needed help, but they were miles from the nearest town, with no cell service to call for assistance. Jason wanted to leave immediately, to hike out and get help, but Mark insisted they wait, convinced that Daniel would return, or that leaving might somehow make things worse. As night fell once again, the forest seemed to close in around them. The fire that had once been a source of comfort now cast menacing shadows. Then, just as they had feared, the whistling returned, louder this time, more insistent. It circled the camp, drawing closer with each pass. Jason, his nerves frayed to the breaking point, thought he saw something moving in the trees. A tall figure, unnaturally still, watching them from just beyond the firelight. He blinked, and it was gone, but he knew what he had seen, and the terror of it threatened to overwhelm him. Unable to sleep, Jason decided to document what was happening. He pulled out his phone, using its camera to film the darkness around them. In the beam of his flashlight, shadows seemed to move of their own accord. The whistling grew louder, coming from all directions at once. It was as if the entire forest had come alive, closing in on them. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the whistling stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Jason and Mark's ragged breathing. The video on Jason's phone cut off abruptly, the screen going black. What happened next remains a mystery. When search teams finally reached the campsite days later, they found it abandoned. The tents were still there, along with all of the group's belongings. But of Jason, Mark, and Daniel, there was no sign. Jason's phone was recovered, the final video still intact, but the footage was distorted, showing only glimpses of shadows and flashes of movement that defied explanation. Forensic experts analyzed it for weeks, but could draw no conclusions about what it might show. Daniel was never found. Despite extensive searches of the area, not a single trace of him was ever discovered. Jason, too, seemed to have vanished without a trace. Only Mark was ever seen again, stumbling out of the forest nearly a week after they had first entered it. But Mark was changed. He refused to speak about what had happened in those woods, not to the police, not to the families of his missing friends, not to anyone. The trauma of whatever he had experienced had left him a shell of his former self. He spent the rest of his life in and out of psychiatric facilities, haunted by nightmares that he could never fully articulate. The Blue Ridge Mountains have always been a place of mystery and legend. But after the events of that summer, they took on a darker reputation. Campers reported strange sounds in the night, unexplained lights moving through the trees, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. To this day, the disappearance of Jason and Daniel remains unsolved. The forest keeps its secrets, and those who venture into its depths do so at their own risk. For in the darkness of those ancient woods, something waits. Something that whistles in the night, that moves without leaving tracks, that can make a person vanish without a trace. As you sit here, listening to this story, ask yourself, would you camp there? Would you risk becoming the next missing hiker, the next unsolved mystery? Or would you heed the warnings of those who have gone before and stay far, far away from those haunted woods? The choice is yours. But remember, the forest is always watching, and it never forgets.